welcome once again to The Law Matters. Of course it does. Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. As we tell you, this program has been created to educate, inform, and help you to decide how to protect yourself, your business, and your family when it comes to legal issues. We provide information and resources that'll help you manage some issues yourself, or if you do decide to seek outside professional counsel, they'll be better prepared, and so will you. Our goal, of course, is always to save you time, money, and achieve the best possible results. As always, we want to once again welcome and thank Attorney David Bizarre from the Bizarre and Associates law firm in East Providence, who continues to provide his legal insights, wisdom, witty anecdotes, and information as we tackle various issues. So today, entrepreneurship, solopreneurship, freelancing in this gig economy, there are legal issues that are associated with doing business in the gig economy. You should be protected. So today we're going to discuss what you need to know, what you need to consider, what form of business you might consider and why. How do you manage to have contracts and enforce them? How do you protect yourself? Apparently, as recently as this October, this has been referred to as a time that is a once-in-a-generation time of surge in startups. I guess in the past 4 decades, the trend has been down, yes, because of the population, but also because there is such a growth in those large corporations. Well, now, thanks to COVID and many other things, there have been more who have turned to freelancing or turned their hobbies, side hustles into what could be full-time jobs. How do you stay protected? So let's start to talk about that, David. People have been out of work at times. Now they've had some government help, but if they're unemployed, they had a hobby and they want to turn it into a job, a little job, maybe a full-fledged business. Let's help people decide how to protect themselves. First thing, if you have a hobby, David, and then someone says, I'll pay you to do that. What has to happen to make sure that that person who's providing the service or the goods, how do they take care of themselves?
So if you have a good idea or a hobby or an interest and you want to monetize it and make it something that you can earn money from, that's the genesis of the start of a business or a venture. And so when you do that, at first, it may not be necessary to incorporate or create an LLC or a partnership if you're doing it with someone else until it really starts taking traction. So I have this idea, I'm going to do this, but I don't want to spend any money on it yet because I'm really not making any money or doing anything from it. It's in the idea phase. And so you're in the process of taking that idea and turning it into money. So you'd have it, the first thing you do is you have somebody who says, I like your idea, I want you to do something for me. So whether it's you're a handy person and you're helping them put something together, or you're making something, or you're creating a product and selling it, when you get that first order, now it starts to become a business. And now it's time to start thinking about how am I going to make sure I get paid for doing what I do, and how am I going to protect myself from a claim or liability and that type of thing. So the first job you do, you might want it, depending on what it is, you know, if you're selling a product and they're going to pay you for it, well, that's pretty much a transactional thing that you don't have to worry about getting paid. But if it's, I'm going to do some work for you and then you're going to pay me, I would right out of the gate say, yep, I'd love to do that. Here's my standard form of agreement or contract. This is what I'm going to do. This is what you're going to pay me. And this is when you're going to pay me. And then have the person you're doing the work for sign that. That's a form of contract that would be enforceable. The terms are spelled out. All of the terms that need to be there are in there. And the person against whom you're seeking enforcement, the person who you're doing the work for, signs it, then it's enforceable.
So we say that we're here to provide information and resources. Fairly literate person could say, here's what I'm doing, here's what I'm charging, just as you described. They could probably even find something online fairly easily. At what point do they actually need to take that a little bit further to make sure that they've covered all of the bases and all of the caveats that they couldn't possibly do right out of the box when they're starting a business? At what point do they need to go from online and their first draft to seeking a lawyer?
So once they have their second client or third client, and business is starting to grow, they really, at that point, should go see an attorney. They should talk to the attorney about what form of protection they should take in terms of an LLC or an S corporation or a partnership, if that's appropriate. And here are the documents I'm using to protect myself in this work I'm doing. Can you review them for me? And perhaps create a draft of a template that I can use going forward.
So before we get into the options of forms of business, knowing that so many people are looking to have not just one client if they start this gig situation, but many, apparently that is sometimes fraught because some people are actually not independent contractors supplying just a job, a particular thing that they've created, but in fact they're in a worse situation where they're given a 1099 or something, and that does not an independent contractor make, even though someone said, here's the work that you've done. How do you go through, and what should someone do to determine whether or not they're being paid as an independent contractor and it's true, or whether or not they really are an employee being employed by someone who frankly doesn't want to deal with the rest of the benefits and costs? So
there's a lot of different situations where this can arise. If you're doing work for a company and that's your only customer, so to speak, and you're doing a certain job for them repeatedly over and over and over, are you an independent contractor or are you an employee? So that really depends on the control that the person you're working for has over how you do your job, when you do your job, where you do your job, whether or not you bring your own tools to the job that you're doing. So there are a lot of factors that go into that, and there's a lot of reasons why the person you're doing the work for may want to call you an independent contractor, and they really shouldn't. And the things that fall into that category are going to be payroll taxes, workers' compensation, insurance or liability for the work that you're doing, and whether or not you have other rights to vacation or other
sick pay,
other types of employment type of rights that an employee would have with an employer. And so one of the things that an employer will do in that situation is, all right, this is a close call because we tell you where to go to work each day. Make up a story. Let's say you're a CNA, and they tell you, go see this person, go see that person, go see this person, bring your own equipment. You're an independent contractor. You drive there. You go to the next job. You may even work for someone else doing the same kind of work for them. Are you an independent contractor? We think you are. You may think you are. There's a form that you can send to the Department of Labor, an independent contractor sort of election form, so that the agreement that you and this employer, so to speak, made is actually filed, and so there's no question that you both agree and you're acting as an independent contractor. But if you don't do that, then you get hurt driving to the person they sent you to. You left from their office to go there. You're hurt in the course of your employment. Is it uncovered under workers' comp what they would call the coming and going rule, or is it part of your employment? And are you an employee, and are you therefore entitled to workers' comp? Those can be very interesting legal cases.
So to that point, as we say, we provide some resources. DOL.gov, I think it's /agencies. Agency lets you go through what would be the Fair Labor Standard Act and who qualifies for what, and part of it does include the issue of you signed, I signed, and here are the terms of our agreements and what constitutes my independence and my flexibility and my potential for profit or loss as a result of working with that person. So it's worthwhile for someone to pursue that if they're going to continue more and have this be more than just an occasional side hustle.
Yeah, it is a legal issue that comes up, and really I used to see it a lot in the workers' compensation realm,
yes,
where the employer said, that's an independent contractor, he's not covered under my workers' compensation insurance, I 1099 him that's not my employee. And the employee says, well, wait a minute. I go to work where you tell me to go. I do the work that I have to do with your tools. I'm under your control. You tell me what days I have to work, what days I don't work, what hours I work. You look at all of those factors and the control factors, and it is where the judge will have to decide, is there enough control of that employee, so to speak, by the employer that makes him an employee rather than an independent contractor?
Yes, and while we're talking about money as an issue here too, when someone is an employee, they have certain minimum wages and rates that they're required to pay. If you are an independent, you have flexibility. Maybe that person who hired you might actually get away with paying less, maybe more, but there's some range there. And if you are an independent person, you are required to take care of your own taxes, which brings up the issue of when someone is going to be vested in this going forward and continuing on this path. There's an issue about when what they choose as their business form, because it has tax consequences. Most people, when they're starting businesses, sole proprietorship. I don't have any liability, there's no trouble, this is the easiest, but that's fraud. Do you want to go through some of the issues with that, David?
If someone wants to be a sole proprietor and have their own business and not have any protection from a corporate shield, LLC, or that type of thing, then I say that's fine. Make sure you have enough insurance. And make sure it's good insurance that's going to cover you against any claim that could come up. So as long as you have some insurance, there's some protection. We still would recommend having the corporation and having the corporation be insured and having the double protection, so to speak, but that happens. So when someone starts out doing that, and I'll give another example, we'll make one up, where there's someone who builds houses and he hires you on all of his jobs to do some of the carpentry work, let's just say. So if you're an independent contractor and you're doing some carpentry work for this person who builds houses and maybe another person who builds houses, and you have your own tools and you bring your own tools to the job, then there's few things I would want to protect me. I would want to have my own corporation or LLC to protect me from any claim against me, number one. Number two, you're right, there's going to be some employment taxes. So you're doing it as a sole proprietor, you're going to have self-employment taxes. You're still going to have the taxes if you get yourself paid through the LLC that you created and the person you're doing work for pays the LLC. That's okay. You're going to still have taxes, but you'll have at least some protection. And I would also want a contract with the person I'm doing the work for that says, this is what you're paying me for this job. This is when I'm getting paid and how I'm getting paid. And I'm not liable for the work to the person who might have hired the general contractor or the builder. If he's building it for someone else, he is. And spell out the responsibilities between you and the person you're doing the work for as far as any claims or liens that might be filed by the person who's doing the work or by anyone else that's a subcontractor to that builder.
What you just described clearly, David, tells me that the average contractor, person who helps with roofs or carpentry, they may not know all of those ins and outs. Seems to me that there are so many options just in what you laid out in the past 2 seconds here, 2 minutes, that there are plenty of things that could go wrong along the way if they didn't speak to a lawyer and find out what should be written in that piece of paper that they're the person who hired them.
And the person who hired them also has issues. And it goes back to the original issues, yeah. Is a possible claim going to be made that this isn't an independent contractor, it's an employee, even though you're 1099ing them, as we say, or not paying them a regular salary or wage. So that person should be talking to an attorney and finding out what steps should I take to protect myself and make sure that there's clear lines of communication and work and who's responsible for what. And what if this guy does something wrong? Do I want him to be liable back to me?
People who are maybe taking drugs. Someone was using a cell phone on the roof and they shouldn't have. There are just so many different things that could go wrong, and who gets to sue? And suppose someone steals from the owner of whoever is building the house, and all of those things, bonding, and those are now becoming much more complicated. So
yeah, so we'll just go keep in this realm for 1 minute. So if you're the homeowner building the home on the land that you own, and you've contracted with the builder who's hiring these independent contractors, you've got to be very careful that that contract also spells out who's responsible to you. What if the builder doesn't pay one of these independent contractors or subcontractors, and can they file a lien against your property for the work that they did, and how is that going to be handled? Those are really important issues to be covered in a contract, in writing, in these types of situations.
Good point. So if someone's just starting out, how would they actually get to know what's considered to be fair pay, and what kind of recourse do they have if someone didn't pay? I didn't get paid, so you're not going to get paid. I'm not sure. I understand the logic in it, but it's not correct. So how do you have protection about that?
So depending on who you are in that chain, if you're the independent contractor who's doing work for someone else, who's doing work for someone else, your contract is with that person that you're doing the work for. So again, in writing, when you're supposed to get paid, how you're getting paid, and any other terms that are important to the job that you're doing in that contract. The first time the person missed a payment to me, I might start, and I'm still supposed to be doing work, I'm not going to keep working until I know when I'm getting paid and what the delay is, and that I'm comfortable with the explanation. Otherwise, I'm walking off the job, I've got my contract, it says this is what I'm owed. I would bring a case against them. If it's just a small amount of money, you might be able to bring it yourself in small claims court, except if you're incorporated, then you can't represent your company because your company is an independent entity, and you're not a lawyer, so you can't represent someone. Just something to bear in mind on that.
Practical information here.
Yeah.
So again, when we're talking about the various forms of business, we started talking about sole proprietorship because that's what most people think first of. And when someone is being paid, if they've been paid, they are required to pay taxes. And they are paid based on their personal income levels. That has one tax implication. Let's talk about the other forms of business, SCorps and CCorps and partnerships, all of which provide additional layers of protection, also additional layers of complexity.
Right.
And at what point, I'm not sure that many want to go through CCorp, SCorp, and the rest without a lawyer, but let's go through some of the advantages and disadvantages.
You file to incorporate a new business, and there are several stockholders in the business, and you may put different amounts of money in, you may have different ownership levels and that type of thing. A C corporation is a corporation it's under the tax code, is taxed at the corporate level. So the corporation files its own tax returns and pays its own tax on the corporate tax rate. And anything that's paid out other than salaries to employees, even owners can be employees and get paid salary, the dividends that are paid out are taxed again when they're paid to the owners. So if the business is profitable, it's paid its taxes, and there's money left over, the surplus can be either kept in the business as a retained earnings, or it can be paid out as a dividend. If it's paid out as a dividend, the owners are paid based on their stock ownership and the bylaws of the company, and they're taxed on the dividends that are paid out. So a lot of folks consider that a double taxation because it's a C Corp paying tax on the profit and then you paying tax on the dividend.
Of course, with a C Corp, too, there is what do they call it, that corporate shield that gives them protection, so they're less likely to be sued. There's some barrier. They're not being sued personally because it's the corporation that is in front of them.
The corporation's own entity which would get sued for the work that it did or didn't do, or the contract it breached, as long as it's signed just by the corporation and not guaranteed by the owners. An S corporation does give you that same protection, but what the S corporation does differently is the taxation, where the income is passed to the owners of the corporation. Personally. So you pay tax on the profit that the corporation makes, or deduct the loss if it's got a loss, and it's done direct to each owner so that it's not stopped at the corporate level and then the potential for the second taxation on the dividends.
And so at some point, when you're looking at your potential liability and how you might or might not be sued, you might look at that and definitely go to see a lawyer. When it comes to your taxation, it may not just be an issue of seeing a lawyer, but also an accountant who can help
Right.
steer you through that. And I'm not going to put you on the spot and say serve as
Well,
a
this is what
tax
we do.
attorney.
What we do is when you come to us as the lawyer to form the corporation, we'll always say, well, you need to speak to the accountant first and find out what they recommend in terms of the taxation of the corporation. Do they recommend a C, or do they recommend an S, or an LLC? And an LLC we can talk about when you're ready.
Why not?
Okay.
That's where I was going next.
All right, so limited liability company, that is a little more flexible in terms of the owners of the company. You can assign different roles to people and different levels of ownership like you can with stock, but you can also break up profits and losses a little bit differently with an LLC. But more importantly, you get to choose what type of taxation you want for the LLC. So you can form on your own, you're the only owner, an LLC, and just say disregard the entity from the owner for taxation purposes, which is like a sole proprietorship. So you get the level of protection of the limited liability company, but you just have the same tax resolution that you would have as a sole proprietorship, which is it's all taxed to you. You could also do the LLC as a partnership, and then you could do it as a limited liability company that's taxed as a corporation.
So what's an LLP? What's the partnership portion?
Limited liability partnership. Different ownership, different protections. In a partnership, every partner in a general partnership is liable for the acts of the other partners. And it's a very precarious situation for partners when you can do something, your partner can do something, and you can be held responsible for what that partner did. A limited liability partnership generally limits the liability of the partners for each other, but has the same tax benefits of a partnership.
There are partnerships that aren't incorporated. How nice and easy. I have a friend, he does this part of the business, I do that part of the business. Sounds like it's such a logical division of labor. Yes, it has that advantage, and then that too is fraught, such as
being responsible for the acts or omissions of your partner. It's a very dangerous way to operate a business, because if your partner steals from somebody, you could be held potentially liable for his act. It depends. I mean, there's some things where you can't guard against it, and you might be able to make an argument you're not liable, but generally, I would tell you on a general level, you're liable for the acts of your partner, and so I generally recommend against a general partnership.
And we didn't touch on this, but when someone just starts a business on their own, one person, then they decide to fold their tent and not do that or change that, that's one thing. But these other entities that are corporations, LLCs, SCcorps, in all cases, as part of what I know lawyers would do, but even if you, I assume you'd have to have a lawyer, how you got into it and what the division of labor is one thing, but also that exit portion of it. How do you divide when there's no longer love in that particular marriage that's called a corporation? How do you dissolve that fairly without it being another very cumbersome and litigious situation?
So depending on the type of entity that you started, if you do an LLC, you usually, when there's more than one person, would create an operating agreement. And the operating agreement can spell out all of the terms of every possible situation. Bringing in new members, in other words, if it was a stock corporation, bringing in new stockholders. How can we do that? Who has a right to do that? Can they be blocked? Can we have control over that? Do we want control over that? If we're doing very well, how are we dividing up the profits from the LLC? If we're not doing so well, how are we dividing up the losses from the LLC? If one of us wants to leave, what are the rights of the other to buy out that member who's leaving? Do they have to sell it to us? Can they sell the membership interest to someone outside of the LLC? These are all things that can go into an operating agreement. And finally, if we're just closing up, what are the rights and responsibility of each of the members as we close up? Do we have to kick money back in if there's a shortfall? Do we have a liquidation plan if we have excess assets that are going to come out of it? There are all sorts of things you can put into your operating agreement.
So while, as we say, there is plenty of information that people can read online, and including a list of questions, such as you've described, but there are many more that unless you sat and talked with someone, lawyer or accountant, business professional, they might not be able to think of all of these issues that can potentially be fraught. So while people are thinking about starting smaller businesses, there has always been a very high rate of failure among small businesses. Right now, apparently, thanks to the wonders of the internet and all things that are in the digital world, the chances of survival apparently have been better because there are new revenue streams that supposedly reduce risk if you're dealing with selling not just out of a bricks and mortar store, which may or may not be open, but now there's e-commerce. There's Amazon, you sell through Google, you sell through Etsy, you sell through Shopify, Instagram, Facebook, and all the rest of these. I know if I ever had a problem with Facebook, I've not been able to call up Mark. He is not answering the phone. He's not answering the phone. So when someone is an entrepreneur, even though these entities are looking to help you start businesses and partner with you and want to be your business partner, what do you say, or how do you possibly address having some protections when you're dealing with those big Amazons?
Yeah, so you don't have a lot of leverage with those big Amazons, so you need to know what the rules are and make sure you're comfortable with the rules, because for the most part, they're not going to be bending their rules for you. So just know what you're dealing with and understand up front what they are and whether it works for you or not. And there are more than just one way to do these things. As you said, there's Amazon, there's eBay, there's Etsy, there's all of those things. I mean, I go back to, I think there was MySpace, but I think that's something different, and I don't want to show my age, but there are lots of different ways to do business on the internet. You can create your own domain or website and put out there what you're doing and try to just be an entrepreneur that way. I just know that it's a totally new e-commerce world, and there's a lot of people who are able to take advantage of that. And so if you're doing it through one of these sites that are massive companies, just know you're dealing with what their rules are.
And yet, I know even if you're dealing with one of the phone carriers, their disclaimers are pages and pages long. The larger e-commerce providers and those who want to do e-commerce are certainly going to be in a disadvantaged situation if they are trying to peruse and try to make heads or tails of most of these things. Do you find now, or do you think that more lawyers are going to be equipped to have to deal with each and every one of these entities because they're so cumbersome and unwieldy in so many ways as small businesses want to start dealing with them?
So as the world of commerce changes, lawyers have always had to adapt to different things. And even the laws have to learn and adapt. You know, the UCC, Uniform, Commercial Code has to change with the changes in how people do business. So we're always learning, we're always adapting, and we're trying to stay up. The law is trying to stay up with changes in the world, and lawyers have to stay up with the law.
It's difficult. When someone is even thinking about buying a franchise, we don't have time to go through this, but is that something that anyone should ever do alone, or is that just too murky and too deep to deal with without a lawyer?
Too many issues that go into it, which is not just the franchise, but where are you doing the business, and if you're doing it in a place that's leased, does the lease run concurrently with the length of the franchise agreement? There's many, many things that go into that, and it's a very interesting world, and it can be profitable, but you need to make sure you've covered all your legal bases.
I know we started to talk about it one time between terms and negotiating leases. That's an entity in itself. Well, as you consider doing freelance work or solopreneurship, we wish you well. We thank you for tuning into The Law Matters. As we say, the law matters to you.